Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. A little bit earlier this week, over on ASRFormula.com, the ASR guys have given us an update to their absolutely wonderful Ferrari 641 Formula One car from the 1990 season. This is version zero point 0.2 beta, and actually I have to say this is a rather substantial update. First of all, the car was updated because Assetto Corsa in its 1.9 guise completely messed up the external sounds on most third-party mods, which is a bit of a shame, but Assetto Corsa is itself a little bit of an ongoing project from Kunos, and of course they're going to figure out better ways to implement different aspects of the game's architecture, and they're going to do it, and then it's up to third-party developers to react. So that's exactly what ASR have done with this car. We have a completely new sound package on this car in comparison to the 0.1 beta, and I have to say it is a very welcome addition. Also, in many ways, and we'll go into this a little bit later on, the car just feels better. It looks a whole lot more polished, and it feels a whole lot more polished compared to 0.1. This car has actually featured in quite a few of my videos because it's just absolutely awesome. I mean, just look at it. But it feels very different now, and it even looks a bit different now than it did in some previous iterations. You can find the earlier version of this car in some videos on my channel, and you can do the comparison for yourself, but it just feels better. It feels like it's more together, it feels like a more complete package, and I certainly am liking it so far. The 641, as I mentioned, was Ferrari's 1990 Formula One car. It was designed by Enrique Scalabroni and Steve Nichols, developed from the 640 from 1989 that had been designed by John Barnard. However, Barnard for 1990 went to Benetton, and you can definitely see that very legendary John Barnard shape if you look at the 1991 and 1992 Benettons. Just look at that. It's so simple, it's so sleek, it's so clean. The entire car is essentially one continuous curving arc from nose to tail. Look at the tip of the nose, join up in the middle with the top of the air snorkel there, and then continue that curve down to the tail of the car below the rear wing. The car is just an arc. It's almost Volkswagen New Beetle-like from some angles, but obviously a whole lot more powerful and a whole lot more aerodynamic. But just a very simple, basic design, and it actually turned out to work pretty well, as of course the record book shows. The 641 capitalized on the technology that the 640 debuted in 1989, namely the 7-speed sequential paddle shift semi-automatic gearbox. Remember, this is 1989, 1990, and we have sequential semi-auto gearboxes with the typical paddle shift that we've been used to seeing in Formula One since then. Just think about how space age that must have been, and think about how much work that must have been to make reliable for a race distance or so. Just incredible technology, and of course Ferrari were the first to debut it in a race situation. The technical specs on this car, they are a little difficult to find, simply because it's a Formula One car, regardless of how old it is. But the chassis, of course, it's a composite carbon tub, monocoque, as we've been seeing in Formula One really since 1981 when McLaren debuted the technology. The front and rear suspension layout, actually very traditional, even by modern standards. We've got the twin wishbones in front, accentuated by push rods that are actually taking up most of the load and do all the damping, of course. You can see the push rods going up into the nose section there. And it is essentially the same story on the rear. No pull rod nonsense going on in these days, and Ferrari in more recent years have been kind of infamous for trying needless pull rod setups, but all push rod here. Very, very nice, and of course it worked a treat. We mentioned that 7-speed semi-auto gearbox, the engine in this, of course, typical legendary Ferrari, a 3.5-liter V12, naturally aspirated, cylinder bank angle 65 degrees, about 710-ish horsepower in this car. When you drive the car, and of course we're going to do that a little bit later on, the car almost feels like it's a little bit underpowered. Now, yes, I am comparing that to modern standards, where basically since the mid-90s, power figures in excess of 800 horsepower, and then of course we can go absolutely crazy into 2004 and 2005, when 1,000 horsepower was certainly not out of the question, and even today, that Mercedes power unit, yeah, more than 1,000 horsepower for sure, but 715 in this car, even though it only weighs 505 kilograms, it feels a little underpowered. It's not slow by any means, but I think some of that underpoweredness, at least that perception of being underpowered, comes from drag. Just because the aerodynamics, the aero philosophy on this thing is essentially 30 years old, and it has moved on quite a bit. Enough of the technical nonsense, though. Let's have a look at the modeling and textures and all of that great development work that ASR have been doing behind the scenes. Start at the front wing. Those of you who have seen my recent review of the 642, this car's immediate successor, will notice some striking similarities between that car and this one. And of course, because they are in sequential years to each other, it makes perfect sense. But you can see the front wing here, very similar to the one on the 642. It's a double plane wing, two elements of it mounted directly to the nose, no pylons as of yet. A few teams had been playing with pylons, but Ferrari, of course, ever conservative with their configurations, they decided to mount it directly to the nose. That upper element there is mostly what's generating your downforce. That lower one, a little bit of pitch you could get in it, but for the most part, that's just a flat plane to clean up the air over those top elements and get it going through the car. See those big radiator inlets to either side of the nose there. Very interesting layout, and Ferrari themselves basically moved away from this after this car. The 642, yes, still has them to an extent, but they started to move them more outboard toward the side of the side pods, and this era is really what started to give rise to the side pod as we know it today, integrating radiator inlet, outlet, and all of the packaging for all of those ancillary components. Moving toward the center section of the car, you can see still a very much traditional windscreen on it. Of course, that was typical of cars of this era. You can see that carbon binnacle, and just peeking out from above Prost's name there, you can see the pickup points for the dampers on top of the chassis. Very nicely done that they would model something like that. The cockpit, it is very clean and very tight, as you would expect from the era. Circular steering wheel in this car. Of course, now Formula One steering wheels are essentially rectangles, but still a very traditional looking anyway steering wheel on this. Only two buttons on it, plus the gear change paddles, but for the most part, recognizable to a road car user. Absolutely great. See the short little stubby mirrors in there that are just kind of pasted onto the topside bodywork. They're just there so the driver can see things. They are absolutely terrible aerodynamically, but you've got to have mirrors, so they've got mirrors. See the intake snorkel there. Of course, the shadow is right on top of it, but nicely modeled there. The 1989 version of this car, I'm not sure if they ran this in 1990, but the 89 version of this car, I know they ran it at Monaco at very least, had a configuration that didn't have the intake snorkel mounted on top. Rather, it had two intakes that were mounted on either side of the cockpit, just above and to the side of the driver's head, to funnel air into the intake plenum that way. It, in many ways, was kind of reminiscent of the solution that Mercedes ran in Formula One at the start of the European season in 2010. They had a center roll bar, and then they had two intake snorkels that ran from either side of it, that roll bar acting sort of as a ram air splitter effect to drive air down into the intake. Ferrari had a very similar layout all the way back in 1989, and it'd be cool if we had that configuration also to run, because it just looks different. Very nice. Toward the rear section here, you can see on the back side of the side pods we have our outlets for the radiators, all of that hot air just being forced out of the car and around the rear tires. You can see the overall idea. Here's the exit from the side pod, and if you can just use your mind's eye to see how the air would be shot out of the side pod and then immediately turned back inward via probably a Quanda type effect around the curve of the Coke bottle section toward the rear, and it'd be accelerated out the top side of the diffuser, again to generate some more low pressure at the rear of the car. Very cool idea. And they're doing this without any physical flow modifiers. There are no turning vanes, there are no flick-ups coming from the bodywork, just pure aerodynamic science. Very nice. Toward the rear, rather pedestrian-looking rear end by today's standards, but you've got a pretty big diffuser. It is an exhaust-blown diffuser. You can see the exhausts from that V12 engine going directly out the center of the diffuser, so the car is throttle sensitive through the corners. It, of course, is going to generate more downforce on throttle because you have an accelerated, energized flow from the exhausts, and through Bernoulli's principle, that's going to suck more air through the diffuser as well. Great detail, though, on the rear. You can see underneath the bodywork they have modeled that V12 engine. We can't remove the bodywork yet. The car is still in beta, just like their 642, ASR 642, which is now in 1.0 stable release. I tend to believe that we're going to have the ability to remove the bodywork on this thing once this does go into a later iteration, if not maybe until the 1.0 version. But they're working on it. You can see the engine has been modeled. Nicely done. Moving to this side, of course we're a little bit in shadow, but you can see some nice texturing on the tires as we've come to expect. Big Goodyear slicks all around. And then, of course, this side of the car is a mirror image of the other. Very, very cool. We can get in close here and see all the sponsor graphics. Some sharp edges, but really nothing to worry about. You pull out a little bit and you don't really notice it anymore. Very nicely done. I love the depth that you get. The perception of depth from the paint. You can see some texturing there on the side of the nose, just maybe where the layup of the carbon wasn't quite the best, and you can see how you get this dimpled effect from the reflections there. Very nice. The paint is also very nicely done. It's not too shiny, just like on the 642. Like I said in that video, the paint on these cars is only thick enough to cover the weave of the carbon. So it's as light as possible, and it's not really designed to look nice, it's just designed to go fast. So there it is. Nice sponsor graphics there on the engine cover. Of course, you have your emergency kill switch and your marshalling clutch. Very cool. We can go into the cockpit here. Give you a sense of what that looks like. And I love that flyover effect as we go over the cockpit sill. And just you get in there and you can just see how thin everything is in the cockpit surround. Of course to save weight, but I imagine that had to be difficult to model for these guys. In any event, though, we are in the cockpit, and nice modeling and texturing throughout. You can see your front suspension anti-roll bar adjustment there on the right-hand side, that lever. And they've modeled the linkage on that lever, which is absolutely phenomenal. Of course, the mirrors here. I do have to say the eye position in this view is a little bit lower than the one we're going to be using once we're out on track, but you can get a sense of what's going on here. The car is obviously switched off right now, nothing's alive, but you can see the typical early 90s Ferrari dash there. It's a split tachometer, so this is the low rev page, and then it goes to a second page where it's got the high revs, so you'll see that in action once we're out on track. Over to the sides of the dashboard, you can see the R button there for reverse, and then I assume that green knob, if you like, that wing nut type knob is for brake bias. On the steering wheel itself, you've got a radio button, and then I think that's an engine kill on the right-hand side of the steering wheel. Of course, these things don't really affect us while we're out on track, but I think that's what they're modeling there. Those of you who are more familiar with the 641 or electronics of that era in general, you might want to chime in there and tell me what those buttons really did. I know one is labeled talk, so that's clearly radio. Over on the seat, perhaps not the best modeling, but you don't see this at all when you're out on track. They've done a nice job with the seat belts and the padding on the seat itself, very nice. You can see the padding there where the driver's helmet would just be cushioned so it just doesn't vibrate against the back of the car. Of course, emblazoned with the Scudetto, the Ferrari logo, very nice. You can see the chassis plate and the FIA registry stickers there. All Ferrari Formula 1 cars have that type of chassis plate, and it's very cool when a modding team decides to include something like that. Just little details to tell you that they really took their time and that they love this stuff as much as you do. Very nicely done. You can still see here in the cockpit, just to the sides of that triangular section of the chassis where the bodywork actually meets the chassis, you can just see the dampers peeking out there. So, brilliant stuff. Again, just adding to that overall sense of immersion. Back to the rear, one more detail I need to show you. Rain light, it works. Yes, it does. It's very bright. It's probably bothering your eyes. I'll turn it off now. I love it. Just the little details like that that show you that these guys took their time and that they really care about things like that. So, without any further ado, we're going to take it out on track. We're going to go to Mugello today. We'll see you there in a few moments. Welcome to Mugello. Before we get out on track, of course, we're just going to overview the different setup options and adjustments that you can make. course, here we've got our transmission, 1st through 7th gear, and of course the final drive. You can adjust these in any way you like. There are a whole bunch of steps for all 7 gears and the final drive ratio. Tires, you've got 3 tire compounds to choose from. We've got hard, soft, and qualifying. Those qualifying tires, well, they mean qualifying tires. They're good for about 2 laps at speed, and then they fall off the cliff massively. For this run, just because we're going to be doing some more laps, we're going to be running the hard compounds, and of course you can adjust the pressures any way you like. Fuel, big fuel tank in this car, 215 liters, as you can see. And of course that would be good for an entire race distance because in this era, as you may know, no refueling allowed during the races, just like today. Suspension, anti-roll bars, front and rear, wheel rates, and ride heights. You can see, you can adjust that any way you like. Aero, front and rear wings, of course they go from 0 all the way up to 18, so you can play within that range. You do not actually see the wing elements change their angle of pitch when you make these changes, unlike on the 1.0 version of the 642 and of course the MP44 from F1 BRC. I do imagine that that's a feature they will be implementing in the 1.0 release of this car. Alignment settings, your camber and toe on all 4 corners. Dampers, same deal, all 4 corners you can change the bound, rebound, bump stops, things like that. Drivetrain, this is your differential, so power, coast, and preload on the diff. Generic, just brake bias front to rear, and your advanced suspension settings, travel range and bump stop, stiffness on all 4 corners. So we've got the hard tires on. We're going to put a fair amount of fuel on board. Perhaps not 30 laps worth, but a fair bit. Just to give you a sense of the overall balance. And we will go out on track. In the cockpit, I just want to point out some basic instrumentation you've got going on the dashboard. You can see our lap time there ticking away in the bottom section there, just ticking past 320. Above that, we have our speed readout. It is labeled in kilometers, but it will actually be reading out in miles per hour. To the right of that, the N, that's our gear position indicator, so you can see that cycles all the way up from neutral up to 7th, and then of course back down again, and then into reverse. You'll notice on the upshift that it hangs for a moment in neutral. That is indicative of the times. We do not by any means have that seamless shift gearbox in this car. It is a 1990 prototype sequential semi-automatic unit. Tachometer, as we mentioned before, scrolling away as the revs do what they will do, which is go into the clouds. And that's about it. So clutch in, first gear, raise the revs, and off we go onto the racetrack. Just an install lap here. Make sure everything's okay and get up to temperature. Well, we're going slow here. Good time to talk about the gearbox. I mentioned it is by no means seamless shift. Your shift times and your shift dynamics are nowhere near what you'd expect today, simply because this is a development unit from long ago. What that means is, yes, you do get an auto cut on the upshift and an auto blip on the downshift, both of which are very welcome. However, the shift times, both up and down, are a little bit longer than you might be expecting, especially if you are more used to driving some more contemporary cars. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, perhaps, if vintage Formula One is not quite your thing, but it works very well, it's predictable, and it does tend to engage smoothly, albeit a bit slowly. Going down through the box there, you can see that auto blip, very nice. It rev matches perfectly every time, so no worries in that regard. gradually come up to speed now on this lap. Continue to build tire and brake temperature. There's full revs on the motor for you, about 13,500 RPM. That 3.5 liter V12 singing away. Alright, so these hard tires are now more or less up to operating temperature. The brakes feel fine. Just sort of get on with the program. In terms of driving dynamics, first, the engine. We talked about how the gearbox is a little bit slower than we might be accustomed from more modern cars, but still does the job quite nicely. The engine is absolutely wonderful. It's a 3.5 liter V12. V12 engines are legendary for being very smooth with their power delivery and overall operation. This is no exception, generating about 710, 715 horsepower. I mentioned that it actually feels a little bit underpowered by modern standards, especially when you consider that the car is only 505 kilograms in weight. But in terms of the engine's power delivery, it is absolutely wonderful. It is tractable, it is linear, there are no peaks or troughs really in the torque curve, at least not at the revs at which you're going to be running most of the time. So it is 100% proportional to whatever it is you're doing with the noisy pedal. Very tractable, very predictable, very confidence-inspiring. No surprises there. And of course, it's just making a glorious sound as it winds out into its higher end of the rev range. In terms of driving dynamics, the way the chassis feels, the way the aero feels when it starts to get working, you can see here our top-end straight line speed, 186, 187 miles an hour, so not all out fast in comparison to more modern cars that could hit well over 200 down that straight. Again, some of that is down to the wing settings, and some of that is down to just this car doesn't have the sort of horsepower that some later versions did. However, chassis dynamics, there is a little bit, just a hint of understeer on the front end. It's nothing too dramatic. It's nothing that's surprising. And you can see with my steering wheel movements, they're pretty controlled and very deliberate. But there's just a hint of understeer. Some of that could be down to the fact that we are running the harder tires, because there is a little bit more bite on turn-in on the softer compounds. But still, it's a chassis characteristic. There's understeer even on those tires. You can dial it out with setup, but out of the box, this is pretty much the default setup. A little bit of understeer. Again, I'm pretty sure that's for accessibility reasons. Aero grip through high-speed corners feels great. It doesn't feel quite as solid as more modern cars, of course, because we are talking about basically a 30-year-old aero package, but it is good enough. Inspires plenty of confidence, and it gives you all the grip that you need. Lets you use those tires more effectively. Despite that understeer, I am rather confident on turn-in. As you can see, I'm turning the wheel once, and the car is going in for the most part. correcting little slides on the back end. Speaking of the back end, let's talk about that. We mentioned it is a blown diffuser, which means that it is sensitive to throttle opening through corners, particularly high-speed ones. But something else I've noticed, and this is purely chassis dynamics of this car, the car tends to develop these understeer into oversteer slides, but they're uniform from front to rear, which is interesting. You'll feel the front end grip, and then the rear end steps out a little bit, and then the rear end grips, and the front end steps out, and they just swap positions in terms of which one is sliding. It almost feels like you're riding a transverse wave throughout the car, and it almost feels like chassis flex, but it's not, because it happens so quickly and it's so uniform from front to rear in terms of the way that those slides transfer between each other that it almost feels like it's just the tires at the limit of grip. But you get these interesting understeer into oversteer and then back again slides, which it's just interesting. I'm not quite sure I've ever felt that in a modern-ish Formula One car before, but it's manageable, and once you are aware of it, you just compensate for it accordingly, mostly by coming off the throttle. You correct for it in exactly the same way as you'd correct for understeer, and then off you go again. Also driving this car, I find myself doing a little bit more trail braking than I normally do, so getting most of my big braking, and then of course the downshift's done in a straight line before corner entry, but then I stay on the brakes a little longer through the apex than I typically do for later Formula One cars, particularly ones with semi-automatic gearboxes. So an ode to the past, if you will, in terms of how you have to drive this. In terms of the sounds, some great sounds from this engine. Finding video, particularly onboard video of this car, when it was racing back in 1990. Of course, these cars carried digital video cameras that were transmitting over a microwave frequency, so their audio quality and their video quality, for that matter, was not all that great. So finding high-quality samples of this car in action, a little bit difficult. There is quite a famous video on YouTube of the 1989 version, the 640, running at Laguna Seca. The driver was wearing a helmet cam, and perhaps that gives us a somewhat more accurate representation of what this engine actually sounded like. But I think the onboard sounds, as you can hear, are very, very good. Perhaps they lack a little bit of the mechanical clatter and din that the car actually produced, but they sound very appropriate, and they sound very much like a Ferrari V12 Formula One engine. So, nicely done, ASR. Completely new sound package on this car from the 0.1 version. There's that understeer-oversteer slide I talked about. The front end skates across the track a little bit, but the rear end skates just a little more. But it happens more or less in unison, so it's an interesting dynamic. The downshifts there. Actually, one of the downshifts was rejected. The 6-to-5 downshift was rejected the first time I hit the paddle, so you've just got to be aware that there's a little bit more latency on that gear change. When you hit the paddle, it's not action complete right away, so you just have to wait for it to catch up to you a little bit on the gearbox side. But as you can see there, upshifting mid-corner does not really unsettle the car too much. Don't do it at full throttle. That's my advice to you. But certainly you can upshift mid-corner if you must. See on the power there, heading toward corner exit. No problem at all. The back end feels very, very planted. Even on these harder tires, it works. That's a big slide. That's a really big slide. That was being unsettled on a downshift. In general, how would I characterize the car? I would say consistent but nervous. Would I say consistently nervous? No. At the beginning of a run when the tires are fresher and everything is just coming up to temperature for the first time, it's there for you. It's absolutely there for you. As the run progresses, as we're seeing right now though, with that huge slide through the final corner, things can start to become a little inconsistent in terms of front to rear balance. High-speed corners like this, no problem, just tickling the throttle below flat out. No issues whatsoever, it'll do that all day long. It's the medium to low speed corners, particularly the long drawn out corners like this at Mugello, where you enter fast and you slow down as you're going through them. The car does not like sudden changes of attitude through a corner, so smooth is the way to go as much as possible in this thing. I left some pretty long skid marks there. Rear tires are just starting to give up a little bit. I'm just amazed at the amount of grip this thing actually has in high-speed corners, considering that this is from 1990. That's pretty impressive. And of course, that very fast chicane, no problem, easy flat. This car will do it all day long. On the brakes. Braking performance is, of course, as you would expect. It's a Formula One car, it's light, it's almost 30 years old, but who cares? Light car plus big brakes equals big stop. This corner one more time. Love it. Love it. Away from me under braking a little bit. Tires are going off. But all in all, an absolutely wonderful car. If you love vintage, early modern Formula One, this is it. And of course, the fact that it was driven by Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell certainly helps with its provenance. But there it is, the Ferrari 641.2 beta from ASR Formula. Check them out at asrformula.com. You can find all of the information that you need if you want to make that very reasonable €1.50 donation to them in exchange for the privilege of testing this car while it is in open beta. Absolutely brilliant work by ASR. They love their Ferraris, yes they do, and I think that they do such a great service to the sim racing community to do such high quality modding work, and not only with the models and the textures and the meshes and things like that, but the sounds, they're great. These mods feel like proper payware. I mean, I guess technically the beta is payware because they ask a donation, but it's just so reasonable what they ask for, and what they deliver is out of this world. If this were a stock Kunos car, I don't think anybody would complain. If this were proper payware, like 1995 or whatever, yeah, sure, maybe they wouldn't have as much clientele, but they'd still have plenty of clientele, and I don't think too many of them would be complaining. But the fact that we get this essentially for free, and when it goes into its 1.0, guys, it will be free. Unbelievable. ASR, you have done it again. You are among the best in the sim racing modding community, and certainly probably in the top 2 when it comes to Assetto Corsa mod making. So thank you to those guys very much, and of course thank you to all of you for watching. Of course, stay tuned for 2 hot laps in this car, yes, at Mugello, without commentary, just so you can see what it does when I'm not quite as distracted, as well as get a sense of what the external sounds are like. So stay tuned for the hot laps, everybody. Until next time, FerrariMan601 saying thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.